It's so crazy when you think about how much cheese making has changed in like the last 150 years. Like cheese has been around for thousands and thousands of years, but then it's completely like changed in the last 150, and it's scandalous to use these natural cultures now.
Welcome to Everyday Homesteading, the show for busy families who want more self-sufficiency without burning out. I'm Josh.
And I'm Carolyn from Homesteading Family. And in every episode, we share time-tested knowledge on topics from growing and preserving your food to raising livestock to herbal medicine and anything homesteading in between.
Let's jump in.
You know, many years ago, great grandma Jeannie lived with us, and she told me a story about how she remembers being on the farm in the Great Depression and how her mom would make cottage cheese. But of course, back then, they didn't have any fancy freeze-dried starter cultures that you would buy from a cheese-making shop. You had to make all of your own pieces that you needed for any sort of cheese making or home dairy making. And so she said that her mom used clabber. Clabber is something that a lot of us are unfamiliar with in our modern culture, but it's only one of the different ways that you can make cheese from just what you have when you have raw milk, which is really, really exciting. And today, we're going to be diving into this concept of what are cheese making cultures. What are these cultures that you need for any type of dairy making, whether we're talking yogurts or, cream cheeses or anything like that? And how can you switch from having to buy them to making your very own? A lot of the things we're going to be talking about today really touch on the exact same principles we use in my practical homemade dairy masterclass, where I walk you through all the different steps of learning how to make your own dairy products at home, whether you have a milk cow or you have to just go to the store and buy pasteurized milk, whatever you have. We talk about all these different things. But today we're going to take it a whole step deeper as we get to chat with Robyn Jackson from Cheese from Scratch. She's really been diving into making natural cheese and making her own starter cultures and making her cheese and her other dairy products still turn out amazing just from these natural cultures that she's making. So we're going to dive into that in just a moment. But first off, I want to say thank you for today's sponsor who's making this episode of Everyday Homesteading possible. Today's sponsor is American Blossom Linens. Now, you guys know, if you've been a listener for a while, you know that we absolutely love American Blossom Linens because they make linens that are going to last. These are heirloom quality linens. They also have bath towels. They have pillows. They have quilts. They have all these different things for your home, but they're things that you're not going to have to buy over and over again. About 3 years ago, I got myself a set of American Blossom towels. And let me tell you, they are now the favorite towels in the entire house because not only are they going strong after years of heavy use, but they've actually gotten softer and softer. And I think they're going to be in use for many more years here around the homestead. Same thing with their sheets. We love them. So make sure you take a moment and instead of buying something cheap that you're just going to have to buy again, look into buying something that's actually going to be high quality and is going to last you for a really, really long time, just getting better and better with every single use. It's all completely grown and made here in the United States, which makes it another win. Right now, because you're a listener, American Blossoms Linens is offering you 20% off your entire order when you use the coupon code Homesteading Family at checkout. So thank you, American Blossom Linens. Thank you for making our beds more comfortable. And thank you for being today's sponsor. Okay, now I want to jump right in to Robyn's story about how she got started making cheese in her own home, and how she really dove in deep to understanding what a culture is and how to make it herself in her own home in a way that gave her really amazing, delicious results that her family absolutely loves.
I actually got started in more of kind of a conventional way. So it was 2014, and my husband brought home a milk cow. He was a former dairy farmer from Wisconsin. And we have a cattle ranch in British Columbia now. So we met and married and bought our cattle ranch. And then he was always just talking about how he missed the milk and he missed the cheese from Wisconsin. So one day I came home from work and there was a dairy cow down in the front pasture. And so he's like, "Can you make me some cheese?" And so that is kind of how we got started in cheese making. At that point, I had like a cheese making book that I had gotten that had a lot of different recipes and stuff in it. And it had like a lot of different ingredients, and it was actually kind of confusing getting going. I leaned a lot on the internet and like watched a lot of YouTube videos and Googled a lot of things and took books out from the library just to kind of learn how to get started cheese making, because it was just kind of confusing when you hadn't made cheese at all. And at that point, we were kind of a small family of 3. So our daughter was only a baby then. And so it was kind of a necessity to make cheese because we were getting so much milk a day. We were getting like 8 gallons of milk a day from this new milk cow. And cheese making is just such a great way to be able to preserve the milk. So so I just kind of leaned into cheese making. I was like, I need to learn this skill. So I learned everything I could. I was using a lot of conventional cultures, and I know we're going to be talking about some natural cultures in today's podcast, but I was using a lot of cultures that you would buy online at the cheese supply store, which is confusing in itself because you would go onto these cheese supply stores and there would just be dozens of these different cultures and they all have these really confusing names. And so it took me a while to figure out which ones I liked and which ones worked really good for my cheeses. And it was kind of like this longer process too, because, cheese making is a longer process if you're leaning into the aged cheeses. So I wouldn't find out if it was working properly until I was like 2 or 3 months down the road. So it was a lot of trial and error early on. And then about 5 years into my cheese making journey, I read this book, The Art of Natural Cheesemaking by David Asher. And it just like completely changed how I made cheese and how I viewed raw milk. It was such a good book. I was just mind blown. So he talked in that book a lot about natural cultures, and he didn't use any of these conventional off of the cheese supply website cultures. He was using all of these natural cultures, like something called clabber culture, which we'll talk a little bit about, kefir, backsplash whey, so taking a little bit of the whey from the day before's batch of cheese and using that in your cheese today. So I learned all of these things from that book, and after I read his book, I was just so excited. And so I completely left commercial cheese making cultures behind, and I dove like 2 feet first into using natural cultures. So I used all 3 really. I mostly was using kefir, but I did use clabber culture, and I was using backsplash whey, and I was just doing all these natural techniques, and it was so exciting. And then 2 or 3 months down the road, I started to eat these cheeses that I'd been so excitedly making, and they were all disgusting. And I was so disheartened. I was like, this doesn't work. Like, what have I done? I've wasted all my time, all my milk. So all of those cheeses ended up going to the compost or to the pigs or the chickens at that point. And it was just really discouraging. So I was like, okay, well, that method doesn't work. I'm going to go back to using conventional cultures. So I went back to that for a few years. And then I had the opportunity to go and learn live from David Asher. He was having a course like not too far from where I live. So I traveled down and learned live from him. And I learned that I was actually doing it all wrong. I wasn't keeping my cultures actually as a culture. And so you should be keeping your cultures kind of like how you're keeping a sourdough starter, where you're feeding it every day and you're maintaining it. And I really wasn't doing that. I was just like making kefir and throwing it into my cheese, or making clabber on my counter and not keeping it as a culture, but I was just throwing it into my cheese and expecting it to do the job of a culture when it actually wasn't really. And so I learned what I was doing wrong, and I was really excited when I left there. So I started kind of using clabber primarily as my culture and keeping a clabber culture. And I got it to a really good point where I was feeding it every day and it was tasting really good. And then I started using it in my cheese making. And then I started eating those cheese 2-3 months later, and they were actually delicious. And so I've completely converted now to using clabber culture in my cheeses. And so that's been a really exciting thing of our cheese making. And I'm a really big clabber advocate now, but I'm a big clabber advocate, but you got to do it right. And you want to make sure that you're actually maintaining it as a culture versus just kind of doing whatever you want and hoping that it works, because it actually does need to be done correctly to work out and make delicious cheeses for your family. So that's the story.
That's awesome. And, we have some very similar experiences because we also dove into David Asher's book when it first came out, and we were so excited. And I did the same thing kind of with the kefir is really where we landed for our family, because we were already keeping kefir, which, you know how that goes. Like, you're already feeding it every single day and like managing kefir every day. So it's like, oh, okay, this will make a lot of sense. But what I found with the kefir, and maybe you've learned differently from here, is that it had so much yeast in it as well as just the bacteria that I started getting like other flavors and a lot of bubbles and a lot of holes. And then with all those holes, I would have a tendency to lean towards mold. Mm-hmm. And so I just kind of had problem after problem. The flavor was never consistent. And so I ended up, doing another natural cheese culture of going a little bit more towards like yogurt or buttermilk. But I also kind of had this like pull back for a moment and like, oh, I'm not quite getting the results that I was expecting to get. And that's frustrating because like you're talking about, you can make a lot of cheese in a week if you have a milk cow. For us, that's often 2 6-gallon batches, 6 to 7 gallon batches of cheese in a week. You start adding that up in your cheese cave, but it's like 3 months before you're tasting it. And then you're like, all the cheese I just made for weeks and weeks and weeks is not going to taste good. It's very disheartening. So it's good for you that you kept trying, you kept doing it. But let's dive in for a moment, just to the very beginning. What is culture? Why do we need it? And do we only use it in like actual cheese making, or are there other dairy products we use that in?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question. So when we talk about culture and cheese making, usually what we're talking about is something called starter culture. So starter cultures are a type of bacteria that like to feed on lactose, which we know as lactic bacteria. So lactose is the sugar in milk. So there's all sorts of different lactic bacteria, but we're going to cultivate or get some of these bacteria online at the cheese supply store, and we're going to put them into our milk. And what it's going to do is it's going to start to feed on that lactose. And as it feeds on it, it ferments it into lactic acid, which acidifies the milk, and eventually the milk will coagulate. Say if you're making like a yogurt, we're going to be using lactic bacteria, but you can also use like a rennet to achieve quicker coagulation. But that starter culture is a really important piece of making any aged cheese. And so a starter culture is going to be like a key thing if you're making an aged cheese. So you need to have some sort of it. For example, like if you're making a cheese using one of the cheese supply store, like you go onto the cheese supply store, you get your starter culture. Usually underneath those starter cultures, I will say all of the different cheeses that this one is recommended for, but you can actually grow those at home with the natural starter cultures, which is really cool and such a fun experiment.
I mean, it really is the same idea as like your sourdough starter, like you were talking about earlier. It's like your bacteria that you're cultivating in order to have a consistent product. So you kind of know what flavor you're going to get, what texture you're going to get. You can, kind of cultivate the specific strains so you get those particular things. But different strains, when you're going to the dairy store, like the cheese supply store, I was immediately like overwhelmed when I first looked for different cultures, because there are so many of these things. They have like code numbers on them. You're not just like mozzarella culture. You're like MA3259B. And you're like, how would I even know? Like, I have no idea what this is or what it does. Let's talk like the basic. If what you're doing in your home is creating bacterial strains. Like, how do you even do that at home?
Yeah. So raw milk is so cool. And we all know the benefits. Probably, if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably looked into raw milk a little bit about the amazing benefits of raw milk. But raw milk is actually its own ecology. So it has everything that it needs within it to feed the cultures that are in it. So if you take that raw milk and you let it sit out on the counter, eventually it's actually going to coagulate. So there's lactic bacteria within that milk. They're going to feed on the lactose. They're going to ferment it into that lactic acid. And when it becomes acidic enough, that milk will coagulate or clabber into that clabber culture. And then you can take a little bit of that and you can feed it to new fresh raw milk. And then you're going to get a lot quicker coagulation. It's going to start to taste better. And then you're going to continue to do that every day, just like you would be feeding a sourdough starter. So it doesn't require a lot from us. It's just us allowing the natural bacteria within the milk to actually do their job, basically, to be able to feed. And a really cool thing about that is that when you get those cultures on the cheese supply store, they're great, and they definitely have their place and can be a really good tool for people. But when I use my clabber culture in cheese making, when I add it into my cheese the day that I'm making cheese, that culture knows exactly how to feed and ferment on that milk, because for days and days and days, I've been feeding it that exact milk. So it can get right to work the minute that it hits that milk. And so this allows me to make better cheese, in my opinion. I think that I make better cheese when I'm using that well-fed clabber culture.
That's really neat. And it's so much fun to think about being able to create something that you need from something you already have, because it's just working with the natural processes of the way milk works. And I love that. But I want to go to the moment for you that you first tried making clabber, because I have a really strong memory of my own of like, you mean you put milk on the counter and you let it sit there for days and days and it's supposed to be okay? And like my cringe reaction to that thought. What was that like for you? Had you experienced clabber before you made it, or were you just like reading a book trying to make it on the side?
Oh yeah, like I knew what happens when you put raw milk on the counter and just leave it and like forget about it. I knew it wasn't good. Like it wasn't really something that I thought would be good in cheese making. And then I just solidified it that when I ended up making all those bad cheeses, because I wasn't doing it properly. But something that's been really interesting for me is seeing how it develops the longer you feed it. So, like your first ferment, that's what I kind of call that first time that you get that first bit of clabber, you put the raw milk on, 3 or 4 days later, it's coagulated. I don't recommend eating like first ferment clabber. Sometimes I see people like they just clabber milk and then they drink it. And I don't like that. I don't think it would tast that good.
It's kind of that like stinky feet flavor, to be honest. In my opinion, it's like, oh, this isn't very nice.
So it kind of grosses me out. And I mean, I don't even know the safety of it. Like I wouldn't recommend eating that first ferment culture, but the longer you take a little bit of that and feed it to new milk every day, you're giving it a fresh food source. And lactic bacteria are kind of like their own worst enemy. They come into milk and they feed on all the lactose, so they eat all the food, and then they create a really acidic environment. And so now they have no food and they have an acidic environment that they can't actually survive in. So they start to die off, and other things like other bacteria and yeast and stuff start to kind of proliferate in the milk. So it's really important that every single day we're giving it a new food source so that it can stay healthy and continue being a really good starter culture for you and a really safe culture for your family.
We're kind of talking around clabber, and clabber is just the natural development of the bacteria that's in the raw milk, just letting it sit out, start to develop, and then to make it usable and palatable and stronger, you're talking about slowly like feeding it and bringing it along to second and third and fourth generations. Could you just like really quickly give a very simple step-by-step of how somebody would make clabber in their own home and when they would know to start using it as a starter and start feeding it?
Yeah, for sure. I'm actually on this journey right now because my cow just calved last week. So I'm restarting my clabber culture from last year. So I always keep a little bit frozen in the freezer, but I like to start it fresh each year because I think it's kind of cool that it goes along with the milk and with the bacteria that are in the milk. So I like to, start it fresh each year. So I just started my clabber culture on Sunday. I like to wait at least 5 days after your cow calves, and then you can get it going. And all you do is you take fresh warm milk from that morning. I strained it so it was nice and clean, and then put it into a clean jar. And then you just put a loose lid on top of it. So I like to use just a coffee filter with an elastic band. And so now it's going to sit on my counter for 3 or 4 days. And whenever I see that it's finally coagulated, which is usually like on day 4, sometimes it's all the way on to day 5. But eventually I will see that it's coagulated, and it won't taste very good, won't smell very good, but I'm going to take a little bit of it and I'm going to feed it to another jar of new fresh raw milk. And usually I go about a pint jar, or you can go a half pint. You don't have to use a whole pint. So say you take a half pint, you're going to take a teaspoon of this clabber, put it into that new fresh milk, again, the loose lid, and you're going to sit on the counter. And the next day it's actually going to be coagulated this time. So it's going to happen a lot quicker. It's going to happen in about 12 to 24 hours. You'll see that coagulation. And then you're going to do the exact same thing the next day. You're going to take a little bit of it, feed to new fresh raw milk, get that coagulation in 12 to 24 hours. And once I see that I'm just consistently getting coagulation every 12 to 24 hours, I'm seeing that it actually is tasting good. So I taste it, I smell it. If it smells really nice and buttery, it should actually taste good. Like it should taste like a nice, not like a yogurt. It's not as tangy as a yogurt, but it should taste like something that you would be just like comfortable eating or drinking. That's when I know that it's good to use for cheese making. So usually I try to go at least 3 or 4 feedings before I'm using it to make any aged cheeses. And the longer you keep it going, the better it's going to get. So like in a month after feeding that thing every day, it will just be like the tastiest product ever. And I use clabber all over my kitchen. Like I'm using it in all of my cooking and stuff. Like even if I didn't make cheese, I'd still want to keep clabber culture because it's just such a cool product, and it's so easy to just implement into your day to day.
Josh's grandma Jeannie used to tell me that she can remember her mom during the Great Depression, and she would make cottage cheese all the time, but she would make it from clabbered milk. Yeah. And so it's so much fun hearing those stories of like, yeah, of course, historically, we didn't have freeze-dried dairy cultures that you could buy from the store. So you had to make your own. Like this was how you made cheese. It's how you made any of your cultured milks of any sort, whether we're talking a yogurt or, and it's not going to be technically a yogurt because it's going to have a different bacterial profile. So if you're really tied to the name, meaning one specific thing, some people are, they're like, it's traditional. You can't call it yogurt unless it's yogurt. But, you can have a yogurt-like product without having to buy something else, without having to bring something in or source something. And I think that's just so much fun to think back to that history and go, well, yeah, this is how everybody did it. Now it seems odd. Now it's different. But back then, that's just the way it was because you didn't have any other option.
Yeah, it's so crazy when you think about how much cheese making has changed in like the last 150 years. Like cheese has been around for thousands and thousands of years, but then it's completely like changed in the last 150. And it's scandalous to use these natural cultures now when it was just so normal for thousands of years, which still just kind of mind boggles me, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I totally love that. Now, I want to ask a really foundational question that we haven't really covered here. It's been maybe a little innate in the conversation, but can you make clabber from a store-bought milk?
Yeah, well, so clabber has to be made from raw milk. So you could get a clabber culture started if you have a raw milk source. You could get a clabber culture started, and you theoretically could feed it like pasteurized store milk, but eventually you're going to have contamination in it because the raw milk's not going to be kind of keeping it going good. It's going to be eventually, if there was something on your counter or something in the jar, eventually it won't be as good. It's kind of like if you have a yogurt culture going, usually you can have it going for like a month or so, and then you have to start one over again because it got contaminated. So clabber culture would be kind of the same as that. I feel like it would be better for somebody that only has access to store milk to probably keep kefir as a natural starter culture versus clabber. I think it would be easier for them. Than having to, have have that potential for the contamination. I have told people though before that were really intent and wanted to have that clabber culture. I've told them that, if you're going to be making fresh cheeses and stuff, you could just make a big batch of clabber culture with the raw milk that you get. And then you could get it going good and then just freeze a bunch of like little ice cubes or something and then just use that to culture some fresh cheeses. I probably wouldn't use it for aged cheese though, just because there's so many things that can go wrong.
Aged cheese has this tendency that if you have anything go off with it, it really takes the flavor profile in a way that it kind of multiplies the not good flavor that can happen from it. And so it can get really bad really fast. So you want to go with like the cleanest, best option when it comes to those hard aged cheeses. So we're mostly talking about clabber right now, but you've also mentioned a couple other of options for natural cultures. So let's talk about the kefir or kefir. You can say it either way. But it is the same thing. For those of you guys who are listening, it is referring to the exact same thing. How do you use that successfully to make a good tasting cheeses?
That's a good question. I don't know if I've quite figured that one out, but it's actually interesting because David Asher is really, he's kind of moved to more, I shouldn't speak for him, but he's kind of moved to more using clabber culture, but he's still a big advocate for people that don't have access to raw milk using kefir as a starter culture. So he actually wrote the foreword for my book, and I had a little thing, and like there's this facts section in the back of the book. So I had on like it's troubleshooting. So one of the things was like my cheese tastes really yeasty. I had written, and then I had a little thing about, well, are you using kefir as your starter culture? Because sometimes like kefir can get really yeasty cheeses, and so he asked me to like change that because he's had a lot of experience with people actually being able to make good cheese with kefir. So I did end up changing it, but I think it comes down to really keeping your kefir like you're keeping your clabber culture and making sure that you're feeding it every day. Like I'm very rigorous with making sure that I've fed my clabber culture the day before I ever use it to make cheese. It's kind of like you would never use sourdough starter that hasn't been newly fed to make sourdough bread. You just know it wouldn't work properly. And cheese making is a little bit hidden because you don't know if it's going to work properly because you're not eating those cheeses till like 2-3 months down the road. So I'm really rigorous with my clabber, and I think that could have been my problem when I was using kefir. Maybe I wasn't rigorous enough with my kefir and making sure that I was feeding it. There is a lot of different bacterias and things in the kefir as well too that will also contribute during the aging. But I think it's definitely worth a go, especially if you're making a lot of fresh cheeses and stuff, that you could make some really good cheese with kefir. I would definitely experiment a little bit with the fresh cheeses and also not put all your eggs in one basket like I did. And just keep your fingers in some other things in case you don't like the taste of it, because it might be kind of an acquired taste too. I'm not really sure. But I just kind of find like the cheeses that you make from it sort of taste like kefir. And that's the thing about clabber culture too. Like I find the cheeses that I make with it kind of taste like clabber culture. That's why it's so important that it tastes good when you're using it as a culture.
Yeah, if you don't like it when it's a culture, you're not going to like it after it's sat for 3
Not
months.
gonna make it better.
Yeah, it's not going to get better. Yeah, that's one thing I always like to say about anything that's either fermented or cultured or even just food preservation. Like it doesn't get better. So if you start with something that's subpar, you're not going to end up with something better in the long run. Like you want to start with the best and then it'll be good when you're done. Yeah, definitely. Exactly. Okay, so let's talk for a second about the backsplash whey, because I've actually never even tried that. So I'm really curious about that. And can you do that across the board?
Yeah.
Or is there certain circumstances where that works?
I'm kind of cautious with teaching people about it because they're like whey is this massive word that can refer to so many different things. Like you can have whey that's made, without any cultures at all. It's just made like with an acid, like citric acid or vinegar, which would never work as the cheese making starter culture. So it has to come from a batch of cheese that was made with a lactic bacteria. It has to come at a certain point in the cheese making process, usually about 12 hours after you've added that culture in. that lactic bacteria, they're going to be kind of at their strongest. And so then you could use it in your cheese making. I don't do it a ton anymore just because I'm using clabber so often. But if you were using like freeze-dried cultures and stuff, and you're wanting to save a little bit of money, you could, you could do that. It's always a bit of a risk though, because you don't know how many bacteria are in there. It's kind of a little risky, but if you didn't put all your eggs in one basket again, you could do it. But you want to make sure that you at least have enough lactic bacteria in there and that they're not starting to die off. So you don't want to use them too late. But I would say about 12 hours would be fine.
Okay, so probably not the beginner option for going with your own natural homemade cultures. Yeah, it sounds like it's got kind of a lot of caveats, which makes sense because you've got to get it when it's live and they don't live in that environment for very long. So maybe like back-to-back cheese making batches might be an appropriate place, but that's about it.
Yeah, like if you were making cheese every day, like just saving a little bit back in the pot. And like traditionally, a lot of natural cheeses were actually cultured with the tools that the cheesemaker was using to make that batch of cheese. Like they would be using natural tools like wooden buckets and wooden spoons. And so these tools would actually get biofilms from the day before's cheese on it, and they'd be kind of become activated as soon as those tools hit the milk, and then that would culture the cheese. So you can kind of use it in that same principle of, okay, well, I made cheese the day before, so now I'm going to add a little bit of milk in here, but you gotta be cautious with it because you don't want your cheese to turn out bad after all the work that you put into it.
For a lot of people, raw milk is a very expensive thing that they do for health, which makes a lot of sense. When you understand the health benefits of raw milk, it's definitely something to pay for if you don't have a milk cow. But it's one of those things, if you're having to buy gallons of raw milk at, sometimes I'm hearing $16 a gallon plus, that's not something you want to experiment with too hard. You want to make sure you know that it's going to work out. So probably not the moment to trial the whey option there. If you have the milk cow in the backyard and you're trying to figure out what to do with 6 to 8 gallons of milk a day, like we do when our jerseys are in, then maybe that's a moment to try it.
Exactly.
So, okay, there's a really real thing that happens when we start talking about cultures of any sort in our kitchen. And you've kind of already referred a little bit to like the smell of clabber, and that especially at the beginning, it can smell kind of funky. But there's a difference between funky and bad. Let's talk about knowing when our cultures go bad and how that's different from like cultured funky clabber smell.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, so I think like a good fed clabber culture should smell sweet. It should smell really like buttery and nice once you have it going good. But at the beginning, when you're just first getting going, that's why I don't use that for cheese making, because it doesn't smell that good. It doesn't look that good. It's kind of probably usually separated. You might see a tiny bit of bubbles in there and stuff like that. It's not something that you want to use in your cheese making. So when I'm telling people for how to know that it's good to use in your cheese making, again, going back to that it's fermenting in the 12 to 24 hours, that it looks just like yogurt. Like when you take a spoonful out of it, there shouldn't be any sort of separation or anything. It should smell nice and sweet. If you're noticing that it is separating really quickly, if you're having a lot of bubbles and stuff in there, if it's smelling weird, like funky or anything like that, don't use that for cheese making. You can take a little bit of it and feed it to new fresh raw milk and see what happens. And usually you can get it back to being good again. Sometimes it just over ferments. Once those lactic bacteria have died off, then other things are coming in and kind of taking hold. But usually you can get it back to that good, sweet tasting thing. If you can't, then you should start it over again. But I really am pretty strict with myself about making sure that I'm only using it when it meets that criteria of smelling good, looking good, not being separated or anything like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like don't cook with it if it's not to that point yet. Either keep going and get it to that healthy stage, or question whether it went bad. One of the things that I think was really helpful for me to learn is the difference between like funky, feed it a little bit more, and like bad, throw it away right now, give up on it, is a extreme smell difference. The word for bad that I like to use is putrid. Like something just died in a jar and is rot. Like
Yeah.
you believe me, you will not. Nobody could pay you to stick that stuff into your mouth if it actually goes bad. If you smell it and you're like, "Ooh, that's a little funky. I wonder if this is bad or not." It's not bad. You
Yeah.
will not wonder at all if it actually goes bad. You will be like, nasty, get it out of the house. Like, don't even open the jar in the house. That's what bad smells like. So you can have a lot of faith that if you're kind of like, this is really funky smelling, just keep feeding it, like Robyn says, and it's going to come around to sweet.
Yeah, hopefully.
Hopefully. Hopefully. I remember the first time when I learned that you could actually clabber milk. You know, I was coming from culture which was like, oh, raw milk is so dangerous. Like, you know, you got to be really careful about raw milk because you could make yourself really sick. So that's what I kind of had echoing in my head.
Yeah.
And we had this milk cow. And so we were being really very clean. And then I heard about clabbering milk and I thought, oh, that has got to be bad. Like this is just bad advice of some sort. But I tried it and I put it on the counter and I remember opening it after 5, like I was too chicken to even leave it like all the way open. So I like had the lid kind of sitting on there and I went and I opened it and I cringed the whole time I was opening it. Like this is going to be so disgusting. And I smelled it. And I remember thinking, I have been so lied to. Like they lied to me because it wasn't nasty at all. Yeah, it was a little funky. We will go with funky, but it wasn't putrid. It wasn't nasty. It wasn't rotten milk. It wasn't anything. And it was like this moment of like, oh, wow, my eyes have just been open. It's kind of a big eye opener when you realize the natural version, the healthy version that God gave us is like a multi-tool in the kitchen. It's not a thing to be feared.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's really powerful. Yeah, it's crazy because same way, like I was very, very careful with our raw milk at the beginning. You know, I was getting these cultures off the cheese supply store, and you do have to be fairly clean when you're using cultures off the cheese supply store. My background is as an operating room nurse, so I know sterility. I can make a sterile kitchen. So you know, I'm sterilizing everything, and everything was getting boiled before I would ever make cheese. It was this whole production. It'd take me like an hour before I ever made cheese to just get the kitchen set up, which it isn't easy when you have little kids and everything. So it was just so eye-opening when I first read David Asher's book about the power of raw milk and how it actually can keep itself safe. And so using clabber culture to kind of, I barely have any contaminations in my cheeses now that I'm using clabber culture because that culture is protective to the milk, which is so interesting and so against everything when I first learn cheese making.
It's really neat. And it's really neat how it leans into this, like it's protective because the bacteria is taking over very actively in that active ferment stage. But you talked about how it ends up in kind of an acidic stage as it moves out of that active ferment and it acidifies the environment. That acidity is also protective of it. And I think that's just so amazing how that works.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah. And building enough acid and to set your cheese up properly for aging so that it can go on. And then that culture now, alongside your raw milk, has all sorts of different bacterias and yeast and fungus within it that are going to properly age your cheeses, which is very cool.
We probably have some beginner dairy makers here who are listening today, or people who are thinking like, oh, okay, maybe I can do this. And they're hearing this and they're like, oh, hard cheeses. That might be a little beyond me. That's probably not the place to start. But do you use the same concept for something like making yogurt? And could you walk us through the steps you would use to make like a yogurt-like substance or what you would call yogurt in your kitchen for something a lot simpler to make?
Yeah, like kind of like making the like using the clabber to make all sorts of different dairy products. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but like walk us through the steps of something that one product that you would make that you feel like is really simple and beginner accessible.
So I think like a cream cheese made with clabber, like a clabber cream cheese, would be probably one of the simplest things that you can do. And it's also super awesome because it gets you set up to know the beginning steps of making all of those different hard cheeses. So for example, like a quark style cheese that I make, you take your milk and you warm it up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which if you have your own dairy cow and you bring that milk in from the barn and you strain it really quick, it's already at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So you don't have to do any extra work. And so you warm that milk up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you're going to add your culture in. So I use the clabber culture, but you could use any culture that you wanted. You could use like a mesophilic freeze-dried culture from the cheese supply store. You could use the kefir. Because it's a fresh cheese, it would be a good one to use the kefir if that's what you have access to. And then you're going to add in a few drops of something called rennet, which rennet is an enzyme that causes really quick coagulation in milk. So you don't have it in all fresh cheeses, but most aged cheeses you're going to have it in. So it's a good one to start with quark because then you get used to using the rennet. So you're going to add that rennet in. Then you're going to put a lid on it and maintain that warmth as best you can. And then you're going to let it sit on the counter for about 12 hours, usually for quark. I let it sit there. And then when I come back, it's going to be really coagulated. There's going to be some separation of the curds from the whey. And then I just dump that into a cloth-lined strainer, and then I tie the cheesecloth up and hang it from a cupboard. And the next day you've got yourself some cream cheese and you just mix some salt into it. So that's a really great one to start with because you're going to learn about the warming of the milk. You're going to learn about adding the culture and adding the rennet in, letting it coagulate. And then those are basically the first 4 steps that you're going to use for all different cheese making recipes that you make. So it's a good one to kind of get your foot in the door. And then you're going to find that as you add on new cheeses and stuff, it's pretty easy to expand because you already got some of those steps down.
Okay, that's awesome. That sounds really simple. Like if you're bringing that warm milk already in from the cow, I mean, if I'm right, I'm adding that up to about 5 minutes of active work, maybe like almost no work at all.
Exactly. It really is almost no work at all. And also, it's so cool once you start doing it a little bit, then you can kind of branch off. So often I'll make quark, but then I'll take half the batch at like 2 hours of coagulation and I'll make that into cottage cheese. So now I'm going to have cottage cheese for my family that week. And I'm also going to have cream cheese. Or I'll strain some off a little bit less. And then now that's our Greek yogurt for the week. So you can kind of play around with it. You're not stuck having to do the same thing. You're not having to have such a rigidity about the recipe, which is how I started. Like when I started, everything was very, very rigid. I followed the recipe to a T. And I think there's some credit to that, but it's also fun to be able to have that freedom to experiment a little bit and be like, hey, this kind of reminds me of what cottage cheese looks like. So now I'm going to heat it up and it's going to become cottage cheese. So you do have that freedom.
Oh, that's really neat. That makes it fun. It makes it more experimenting. And remember, you guys, like, sometimes when we're experimenting, when we're learning, there are things that we're like, oh, I don't like how that turned out. And it's okay to give yourself grace in that. But when you're working with really good ingredients like this, the chances that you're going to end up with something that's delicious and edible is extremely high versus, when you start using things that are maybe made more in a lab than they are in an average kitchen, then you have to be really exacting. But this, like you're saying, just gives a lot of flexibility. Do you have recipes and walkthroughs for all of these things in the book that you've just released?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've got all of that kind of stuff and lots of information in there on how to get set up and equipment and ingredients and how to navigate the cheese supply store if that's the avenue you want to go and troubleshooting and stuff like that.
So you have all different options in there for making cheese, not just these methods. That's awesome.
Sure. I think there's a lot of merit to choosing the culture that works for whatever is going on in your lifestyle right now. Like sometimes it might just be way too overwhelming to think of keeping another thing alive on your counter. So then, the cheese cultures, they have their place to serve people during those times too. So there's options for both.
That is great. You guys need to check out, if you're interested in this topic, make sure you check out this book right here. It is Cheese from Scratch, natural cheese making from home that Robyn wrote. It is amazing. I've gotten to check it out. Oh, yay. You've got it right there. It is a really great. It's going to answer all your questions, walk you through the basics, or you can go visit her over at cheesefromscratch.com and learn more about her and her methods over there. But thank you so much. Before we totally wrap up, though, if there's one myth that you would like to debunk about natural cheese making, what would it be?
That you can't make good cheese. I think that you can make amazing cheese with natural cheese making. I think the key to it is using really fresh raw milk. So the fresher, the better. And then using really strong starter cultures like clabber that's been well fed.
Wasn't that a great conversation with Robyn? I just love getting to hear how other people learn things in their kitchen and the journey that they've gotten to go through that has gotten them to new and deeper understandings. And, I think that makes me really feel like, remember, you don't have to do everything perfectly. Start small, enjoy the process, and see where it gets you, because you never know. You might be developing the next book in the homesteading world just because you're following your interests, just because you're starting small, trying things out and experimenting and having fun. That's the really important part. So, hey, if you want to learn any more about Robyn, make sure you go check her out over at her website, cheesefromscratch.com, or check out her new book, Cheese from Scratch, Natural Cheese Making from Home. It's available from Homestead Living. I'll leave the link for you over in the show notes. And if you'd like to see any more of our cheese making or dairy making tutorials, you can find them over at homesteadingfamily.com, along with all sorts of practical guides on working with raw milk, making butter, and creating a full homestead kitchen, no matter where you're at right now. Thank you guys for listening. I will see you next week.